Coming up today on Uncommon Sense, join me as I interview Brady Stiller, author of the new book, Your Life is a Story, which is about G.K. Chesterton. Stay tuned. Hello, and welcome back to Uncommon Sense, the official podcast of the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton. I'm Grettelyn Darkey, your host, and I am so happy to be joined today by Brady Stiller. Brady, thank you for joining us.
Of course, happy to be on.
It's great. It's great to have you. We are very excited as well to have you as a speaker for our Chesterton conference in just about a month here. So thank you again for that too. But for those of our audience who haven't heard of you, would you mind just giving a brief introduction to yourself?
Of course. Probably my claim to fame when it comes to Chesterton is I was a student at the University of Notre Dame, and I had discovered Chesterton late in my years, which is probably about the age of 18, when I had took a course called Chesterton and Catholicism under the professor David Fagerberg. And it was a few years later that I would have the opportunity to write a book about Chesterton, which is what I will be speaking about at the conference this year. And I'm sure will be kind of the main focus of our discussion today. Pretty widely connected in the Chesterton circle. I know many people personally, of course, David Fagerberg, Aidan Mackey, who collected the archive materials in London, of course. We're saddened by the news that he recently passed away.
Yes.
Many others in the world, Dale Alquist, of course, and of course have spent many times in London and around England seeing Chesterton sites. So getting to see those things firsthand and really just have this opportunity now with this book being marketed by Word on Fire to be marketed around the world and in the hands of a lot of readers, young and old, everyone who loves Chesterton. And really just trace that all back to my time at the University of Notre Dame, which, of course, as some people know, Chesterton himself visited Notre Dame for a semester giving guest lectures. And he also kind of famously had written a poem on Notre Dame football. So just mainly the endless tie to Notre Dame, also being known as maybe one of the biggest fans to roam the paths and campus of Notre Dame is a little bit of my relevancy here. And of course, now with the book that's going around through Word on Fire.
That's so great. I also discovered Chesterton in college, kind of by accident. It's a good time to find him. It's, a time we're all looking for meaning in our lives, which is what your book is kind of about. So let's just dive right in. And I read a little bit of it and I'm really enjoying it so far. Highly recommend. But you talk a lot about worldviews and how that shapes people. Let's maybe start there if you're okay with that.
Absolutely. The book certainly explores worldviews, and what's at the core of it is Chesterton's worldview. I think just taking a step back and thinking about how we even got to writing this book certainly was really the source and product of divine inspiration. I remember that moment that really I was not planning to write this book, but I was actually conducting scientific research. I was studying biology as my main major, but also theology as my other major, deeply involved in a scientific research lab, and had just felt this very subtle but certain conviction that I needed to write this book. And, I was thinking all throughout the Christian tradition of just this deep sense across so many great thinkers, Irenaeus, Augustine, as late as Newman, Chesterton, that this deep sense of vocation, that our life is a story, and that God calls each of us to live into a best story. There's certainly a sense of objectiveness to this. And I start that way explaining that because that wasn't something I think unique to Chesterton. It was something I felt deeply throughout my life. I had felt that deeply even before I had discovered Chesterton. This is maybe not something that everyone knows, but for many years I was discerning the Jesuit priesthood. I was about to enter the novitiate. And I think that was also very important background context for how I was so in touch with my story and kind of knowing this deep sense that God was calling me to a best life, and that, I might have a good sense of the direction of my life, but that God ultimately was the author of my life story. And thankfully, because God's intentions are the best and we have a good God, we can trust him that he's leading us to the best. So that's maybe an indirect way of beginning to answer that question, because when I decided to refine the scope of my work, I realized that Chesterton was the author that I needed to focus on in writing this book. And so the book is not really focused on anyone else in the Christian Catholic tradition, which certainly could be, those could be books that could be written. However, Chesterton, I felt like almost best of anyone understood that concept deeply. And then when I was rereading his works with that particular focus in mind, I was floored and astounded that Chesterton indeed was the perfect person to capture the sentiment in every single one of his writings. I think famously in Orthodoxy, which is personally my favorite book of his, he says so early on that he had always felt that life first is a story, and that if there is a story, there's a storyteller. Mm-hmm. I think that was one of his earliest instincts in really like primitive philosophy of life, that life is a story that, of course, predated his entry into the Catholic Church officially by decades. And I think it's that core philosophy that he found a home for that within Christianity, within the Christian tradition. And really, he realized that had been the Christian philosophy, the Christian worldview in a way, for 2,000 years. And of course, that is the worldview of even the Jewish tradition, really, as captured in the Old Testament for all time. Really just looking at the Bible itself as not just a collection of stories, but an overarching story itself. But then also each of our lives is a story, and it is meant to find its place within this story over time. And really this, you mentioned meaning as well. If there is this sense of objectiveness, which I think Chesterton deeply understood and really is a core focus of my book, we cannot experience the fullness of meaning and fullness of our own fulfillment if we are trying to live a life apart from the best life that God has in mind for each of us. That raises a lot of questions. Is our life predetermined? If there is a best life that each of us is meant to live, if I decide to go down one path versus 100 others, am I making that harder for myself? Am I disqualifying myself from the best path? That seems to put a lot of pressure on ourselves. Yeah. Those are all valid questions, and there's objectives or objections that I think are rather valid. And it has been sort of a deep philosophical question and discourse as long as we've been alive. However, I think Chesterton kind of has the right answer, and it was in discovering that that I really found the purpose for writing this entire book to answer that question.
Beautiful, beautiful. I think it's very needed too in this day and age. I mean, so many people are trying to create their own reality and sort of force reality to conform to them, and it's clearly not resulting in their best lives. There's not a lot of happiness. There's a lot of angst. There's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of anger, and it's unfortunate because you kind of just want to take people and be like, here's the answer. Just try this, just try it. But it does take a lot, I think, for people, especially in our Western culture, who have been sort of raised on, I mean, it's kind of like Disney, for a lack of a better word, that, you sort of go out and you address this beautifully, but you go out and create your own, choose your own adventure, right? But it's not in the sense of like going into the bigger story so much as like you are the God who's making things happen. And I'm very interested to hear more about how you address that tension, because you did like right away, like the tension between the subjective reality of choosing and not having a predetermined life, and the objective reality of there being a best way to live, and how those work together. Could you talk a little more into that, perhaps?
Yeah, I think you're totally right in bringing up these philosophical points of objectivity and subjectivity. And it's funny, it reminds me of a point that Chesterton even makes, that, even these deepest theological questions, they become philosophical. They sort of end in paradox. It's sort of unavoidable. Of course, Chesterton is, the prince of paradox, as we all know, and he was often accused of relying too much on paradox. But I sort of realized it was actually within the concept of paradox that the answer could lie to this deep philosophical question. And the use of paradox is not so much, a lack of his intellectual ability to answer these questions, but maybe, the very proof of it. And so it is this question of objectivity and subjectivity, which is, I think, the tension. Those are maybe philosophical terms applying it to maybe these questions, as you're saying, of do I create meaning or do I find it? I think we all have maybe a stance on that, which is kind of an early claim I make in the book, but we might not think of it in that way. And so there have been many key philosophical worldviews over millennia, and that's a claim I make early on as well. There are so many different worldviews on whether we create or find meaning, and how free we are in that process. However, they really do fall into core buckets. And in Chesterton, through an analysis, and kind of as I show in my work, they really do fall into, I would say, four buckets. And that leads to what I call the spectrum of meaning a little bit later on in the book. So, those four worldviews that I say Chesterton argued against, the four main ones, there's determinism, which of course is sort of a pure objectivity, a tendency to say that really we're not free. It can take many forms. He saw it in the form of scientific determinism. Of course, evolution was really big in his time. Mm-hmm. AI is big in our time right now. I'm finding a recent interest in this. But of course, there can be deterministic tendencies with that to say, we're really not free. This is all sort of just a firing of neurons, or really everything is a product of environment and genetics. Of course, that was a big argument in Chesterton's time. Of course, it can also take a spiritual turn as well. Of course, Calvinism was, maybe a certain religious tendency that Chesterton had argued against, where he said, the epilogue is, the start of life, where before you've even begun life, your eternal fate has already been decided for you. And he felt something was really wrong with that. So, of course, determinism. I would say, though, that that's not been where we've been as a society and culture today. I think you were alluding to maybe the opposite extreme, which is a pure subjectivity. So that's what I call in the book existentialism. And that's maybe the one worldview that Chesterton did not call it by that term. I believe existentialism as a term, as sort of this pure subjectivity, didn't really come to be until maybe the mid-1900s, especially under Jean-Paul Sartre. However, if you kind of know the main tenets of existentialism, you see it everywhere in Chesterton's books as well. such as like free love, relativistic morality, individualism. You see it everywhere. Chesterton arguing against that as well. And I would say that's sort of the extreme, I think, we've been as a society and culture, this maybe overemphasis of subjectivity. And, I do make an observation in the book as well that kind of relying on Chesterton's image of a pendulum and how there's always maybe fads or movements every few decades. Same thing goes with this. Society might be overemphasizing objectivity, and then realizing that it's not working, it's leading to societal breakdown, it's a failure in many ways. There's sort of this reactionary movement to go to the other extreme. We can see that politically, culturally. I think that's sort of a prediction I think we can make with Chesterton's wisdom, that if today we've been overemphasizing subjectivity, when we realize how it's leaving us dissatisfied, there might be a reactionary movement, whether it's politically, culturally, religiously, etc., to maybe move to the opposite extreme. And so, there are a few other worldviews. Just had walked through the first two. There's also skepticism, which Chesterton argued against, which is sort of a position of we can't really say anything too certain about whether there is meaning, or like what freedom is, which ultimately leads to a paralysis in really never seeking out a meaningful life. And then just jumping to the last one is nihilism, which in terms of its relation to the other worldviews, it's not really on the spectrum because it's the claim ultimately that there is no meaning. And I do make a definitive claim within the book, relying on Chesterton's wisdom, that any worldview that is not perfect and satisfactory when it comes to the principles of freedom and meaning, they can work for a while. Existentialism can work for a while. They can satisfy. They can seem to fit, most of reality about what is subjective, what is objective. Same with determinism. Same with skepticism. However, any worldview that does not correct itself is bound to crack. And, there comes that point where there's this feeling of this is not working anymore, and I have to stop pretending. We can call it an existential crisis in a way. Mm-hmm. And if it does not correct itself on those key principles, it can lead to a double downing, and a doubling down when it comes to this rebellion that maybe life is not meaningful. Maybe this is just all a mistake. And that is what Chesterton understood to be nihilism, and really is kind of the ultimate sin and ultimate curse of reality for Chesterton, because, he knew that this world, even reduced to its basic components, is worth giving thanks for. It is good. And so those are the four worldviews. And then that's maybe a long-winded way of getting around to what is the answer to this ancient philosophical question. Mm-hmm. Perhaps it's good I didn't rush to the answer, because this has been discussed for thousands of years, yes, really as long as humanity has been alive. But I do think ultimately Chesterton has the right answer to this. And one possibility is that life is, pretty objective and pretty subjective, right? So there's definitely objective elements. We've been born into a certain family, a certain time of history, with certain genetic makeup, certain tendencies, etc. And that sort of predisposes us. I think most reasonable people would acknowledge that there's some objective elements to life. At the same time, there are many subjective elements to life. There's a seemingly endless amount of possibilities for where we could take our life. I might be predisposed toward becoming a musician, but I may never go down that route because I'm following my passions, or just, want to take life in a completely different direction. So there's strong arguments to make for both. I think it is, that might seem like a satisfactory and correct answer, that life is kind of 50% subjective, 50% objective, if we want to put it that way. However, using Chesterton's wisdom again, with his idea of paradox as unveiling deeper realities, and paradox being life is 100% objective, 100% subjective, could that not be a more accurate reality, more true to reality position on this ancient philosophical question, even if we can't fully wrap our minds around this? Is that not a more capacious answer ultimately as well, where we're not losing either the objectivity, the certainness, the framework? We need somewhere to go to. We need the objectivity. We need guiding values, but we also don't want to lose our identity. And in this way, are we not upholding both at the same time, saying yes to both? And really that, I think, is what Chesterton presents as the genius of the Catholic Christian philosophy, if we want to put it that way. And ultimately one that frees us from an oversimplification of maybe having to run toward, either side. And I will say, just as a closing thought, and more practically, this is an argument that I sort of voiced over to a lot of my friends, even friends who maybe, grew up as believers. However, maybe you just are kind of, just living coasting their life, not thinking too much about it. But this has resonated very deeply with them. And even when I present this argument, not so much as a religious argument, but more so as just a philosophical argument for how to think about life, something is resonating about this argument. So I think just really has confirmed, the original feeling that I felt of this vision, of this wisdom of Chesterton. And I think really just frees us, and really everyone, whether maybe they think of life a little bit more predetermined and there's nothing you can do about it, versus nothing's predetermined, I define the course of my life. I think everyone can find a place within this framework, which ultimately could be most true to reality, even if we can't fully wrap our minds around that concept of paradox.
No, it's very Catholic for sure. And it feels very true. And I don't like to use the word feel unless I actually mean feel. Like it doesn't, I don't think that it's true, and that I can't think it out completely, because it is extremely paradoxical. But it does feel like the right thing, doesn't it? Because you can make choices, and especially, as you look back on your life, you can see things. The older you get, you can see things. If I chose this, it would have gone this way. But I chose this instead, and so it's gone this direction. And there's definitely a feeling that your choices matter, but there is also a strong feeling that there are things that are supposed to happen, and that something or someone wants to happen for you. So like, how does that fit in? It's a very interesting synthesis, and I'm so glad that you're drawing it out of Chesterton, because it's there in so much of his work, and it's great to have somebody drawing it out for us. So talk more about the paradox, if you don't mind. Like, so what is what are some examples that Chesterton specifically gives of how this synthesizes?
Yeah, I think a few quick hitters that come to mind. I think Orthodoxy, again, my favorite book, just because it marks that moment in his life where he comes to certainty about his worldview, of course, predated by heretics, which he was accused at that time for really just denying other people's worldviews, but not really laying out his own. You could just feel this intellectual turnaround, even just this existential turnaround for Chesterton, where he comes to confidence about his worldview. And it's within Orthodoxy. Of course, I already mentioned that quote of how early in his life he felt life was a story. The other key quote, I believe it's in the first chapter, or one of the first few chapters, very early on. He says, it's this Christian philosophy that meets this double spiritual need for the familiar and the unfamiliar.
Mm.
I think that's a quote that I maybe glanced over in my first reading of Chesterton. However, I realized that was at the crux of it. And when you read all of Chesterton through that framework of the familiar and the unfamiliar, you realize that's the paradox of meaning and freedom. The familiar, the determined, the objective. We need a framework. We need guiding values. We need to know where to go. I think there's a sense of being lost if we don't have that, if we don't know ultimately where we're going, if there's not a sense of what is better than another thing besides just my own feeling of what is better. At the same time, we need the unfamiliar. We don't want everything to be determined for us. We need our freedom to be real. And it's almost weird to read some of the arguments that he argued against in his time, because we're facing quite the opposite today. But when he, argues against Mr. Blatchford, for example, of just there is no such thing as free will, I think our society wouldn't really understand kind of that argument, since we're so much on the opposite side today.
However, in some ways, I just push back on that a little bit, because I think, if you look at like the woke movement, it's actually very deterministic. The way the color of your skin, your economic situation, these things determine how you live, and there's no breaking out of it, according to that philosophy. So I think it's interesting, because there is a strong strain of like you create yourself, but there's also a strong strain of you can't change anything.
That's interesting. I've never thought of it that way, but I think certainly the framework that's laid out in my book, I think is a helpful way, sort of a hermeneutical lens through which to view society today. And, I invite everyone, who may encounter, this framework in my book. I'm sure it'll give them a new way of reading Chesterton, but also reading our society. Mm-hmm. So it really was that quote of the determined and undetermined. We have this deep, not just one, but existential need for both. And if we don't have both, we're unsatisfied. Of course, it can work for a while, as I said, where maybe there's a period of our lives where we're feeling very deterministic, or maybe quite the opposite, where nothing's really determined. I'm just kind of living my life as I want. But then there kind of comes a point where, maybe deep down you're feeling, have I been lying to myself? Have I been pretending maybe for the past few decades? Of course, if it's very severe, that's maybe what we call an existential crisis. And of course, that's kind of a moment to correct your principles on freedom and meaning. So that's one, I think, of the key quotes for Chesterton. I think also backing up and defending the paradox of meaning, which is that life, could it be 100% determined, 100% undetermined, 100% objective, 100% objective at the same time, in a way that we can't really fully wrap our minds around? Mm-hmm. That seems like a dangerous claim in many ways. However, the way that I defend it in the book, and I think the way that Chesterton defends this, is he says, is paradox not inherent to the dogmas of Christianity? Jesus was not 50% God, 50% man as a demigod. He was 100% God, 100% man at the same time. And that might seem like an irrelevant point. It doesn't really matter whether Jesus was a demigod or not, or fully God, fully man. However, if you even look back to the earliest theologians, really our salvation depends on that point. If he was only partially human, are we not fully saved? If he was only partially divine, then was he not fully powerful to bring our salvation about from within? And so that's certainly a key point in really just doubling down on that point of that dogma in Christianity is paradoxical at its core. I think another example of that, the Trinity. The Trinity is three and one at the same time, fully three persons, fully one at the same time, in a way that we cannot wrap our minds around. And then a third example, the Bible. It's not partially a human book, partially divinely written. it's fully divinely written, but also fully a human book where you can feel the humanistic qualities. These were actual authors who were freely writing through 100% the divine inspiration in giving us, sacred scripture. So I think it's those examples that I think personally for me just gave me a little bit more confidence in making that argument, realizing that I think Chesterton's right about that. There is something inherent about paradox, and maybe that could be the key to this answer, in really just this ancient ontological question. And it also just is very Chestertonian to come to that answer as well. He sees many other philosophies and worldviews as ultimately taking one principle, one truth, and running with it. That's what he would call heresy. That's what he would call any worldview that's not entirely right. And so if the tendency, according to Chesterton, is to just take one value and to run with it, to overemphasize it, how could it ever arrive at a paradoxical worldview, which is taking both at the same time, holding them all up in a perfect balance? I think that's characteristic of Chesterton.
No, I love that. That's wonderful. And, I don't know, maybe I'm small-minded, but I sometimes think that that's how heaven is going to be infinitely interesting, because we'll get to figure out those paradoxes very, very slowly throughout all eternity. Because there is a lot about our faith that is it literally impossible to get our minds completely around. And it's this idea of paradox that kind of helps us do that. So it's really cool. Well, thank you so much. I think we're coming towards the end of our time, but it's so exciting to have you on. I think it's going to be a great talk at the conference. Where can people find your book?
Sure. It's online in many places. Of course, Word on Fire is the publisher of the book. So on their website, it's also available through Amazon, whether it's a physical copy or Kindle. So those are the main places. Of course, there might be other retailers. And then, of course, there might be opportunity for me to bring some copies of my books to the conference. But certainly looking forward to continuing this discussion in many ways at the conference.
Yeah, wonderful. And if you'd like to get a signed book and meet Brady in person, please sign up for the conference if you haven't already. You can go to chesterton.org/conference and find out everything you need to know there. Once again, thank you so much. This has been really very interesting. Thank you, Brady.
Thanks, Grettelyn.
And thank all of you for tuning in with us. Please don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, let that algorithm know that this is a good thing that we're doing and more people need to hear about it. More people need to come to know Chesterton, because as we know, Chesterton is always better with friends. Thank you. See you next time.